Module 5, the muscular system, histology and physiology. The neuromuscular junction in a skeletal muscle. In an earlier section, I told you that skeletal muscle is voluntary. That means you can control it when it contracts. Well, you need to realize that skeletal muscle cannot move unless a neuron stimulates it. That's why if a person has an injury and severs certain nerves, the muscles that those nerves serve will not be able to be used. They need a stimulus from the nerve in order to contract. Nerves are bundles of neurons. A neuron is the functional unit of the nervous system, or a nerve cell. Some of those neurons are motor neurons, which are specific nerve cells that rapidly carry signals, called action potentials, from the brain and spinal cord to the skeletal muscles. So a motor neuron is a specialized nerve cell whose specific job is to control skeletal muscles. Neurons do not look like typical cells. In fact, they have a very long process that extends a long way away from the main cell body, kind of like an extension cord. This process is called an axon, and its job is to carry signals away from the main cell body. Some axons are quite long, extending up to 3 feet away from the cell body. The axon reaches the perimysium, which surrounds many muscle fibers. At this point, an axon branches out so that each branch reaches individual muscle fibers at a neuromuscular junction. Now, at this junction between the neuron and the muscle fiber, there's not an attachment. Rather, there's a very small gap. We call this a synaptic cleft. This junction is one type of junction between neurons and other cells of the body. The term for the interface between a neuron and another cell is a synapse. Now, let's take a closer look at a neuromuscular junction. The muscle fiber contains lots of myofibrils and mitochondria inside. There is also, of course, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You can see how the axon of the motor neuron splits up into several branches as it approaches the muscle fiber. Now let's take a closer look at where the axon meets the muscle fiber. You can see the synaptic cleft between the two. At the end of the axon, the tissue spreads out a bit to become the presynaptic terminal. The membrane of the muscle fiber at the synaptic cleft is called the postsynaptic membrane. If you think of a signal traveling down the axon to the muscle, you can see how there's a presynaptic terminal, then a synapse called a synaptic cleft, and then a postsynaptic membrane. All of these features of this location have synaptic in them because they are associated with the synapse. Now, there are many organelles in the presynaptic terminal. Mitochondria produce energy for the neuron. Synaptic vesicles are sac-like organelles which hold a chemical called acetylcholine, or ACH. Acetylcholine is one of many chemicals called neurotransmitters. A neurotransmitter is a chemical released by a neuron, which diffuses across the synaptic cleft, enabling the neuron to communicate with another cell. A neurotransmitter then transmits the neuron's signal, moving from the presynaptic terminal of the axon across the synapse. It needs to diffuse across that gap because axons do not directly touch other cells. The acetylcholine will then bind to the muscle fiber and chemically stimulate it, beginning a series of signals that will eventually cause the muscle fiber to contract. So we can say that the motor neuron actually controls the muscle fiber, communicating with it by releasing acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. Once ACH binds to the muscle fiber, it sets off a series of chemical processes, some of which you learned about in the last section, which will signal the muscle to contract. But there's more to the story. If ACH just remained at the postsynaptic membrane, it would continually be telling the muscle to contract as long as there was ATP energy available to continue the contraction. But that would mean that when you brought that slice of pizza to your mouth to eat it, you would be stuck holding your arm in that position even if you didn't want to. So something has to happen to the acetylcholine. Well, there's an enzyme present to help out. It's called acetylcholinesterase, or ACHase. The word ending ASE usually means that the chemical is an enzyme. ACHase renders ACH inactive so that the muscle cell can relax. In fact, the active chemicals in spray insecticides work to kill insects by breaking down their acetylcholinesterase. So their muscles continually contract and they're unable to control their movement. Well, Now you can see how the motor neuron controls the muscle fiber by secreting ACH in order to stimulate muscle contraction, or not secreting ACH so the muscle relaxes. And when ACH is secreted, it's rapidly broken down by the enzyme ACH-ACE, or acetylcholinesterase, so that the muscle doesn't remain contracted. This entire process begins with a neural signal that quickly travels along the axon of the motor neuron. It's called an action potential. It's kind of like an electrical message that sends the synaptic vesicles to release their acetylcholine. When the ACH diffuses across the synaptic cleft to the postsynaptic membrane of the muscle fiber, it interacts chemically with special proteins in the cell membrane called receptors. That begins a second action potential in the muscle fiber's membrane. The first action potential was along the axon of the neuron. The muscle action potential travels along the cell membrane or the sarcolemma until it comes to a T-tubule. Remember that T-tubules are the pits in the sarcolemma leading into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. As the muscle action potential gets into the T-tubules, it then can signal the sarcoplasmic reticulum through them. Here's where the calcium ions are stored that are necessary for attachment to the troponin that sets off the series of events to allow the sarcomere to contract. Well, how did the calcium ions get to the sarcoplasmic reticulum in the first place? Well, the concentration of calcium ions is greater inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum than outside it, so the sarcoplasmic reticulum has to expend ATP energy via active transport to bring in excess calcium ions for storage. When the muscle action potential reaches and moves down the T-tubule, it reaches the sarcoplasmic reticulum, causing the calcium ions to be released. The ions diffuse out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the sarcomeres of the myofibrils and attach to the troponin on the actin myofilaments, and the contraction is then able to begin. So, when the motor neuron stimulates the muscle fiber, calcium ions are released by the sarcoplasmic reticulum and move into the sarcomeres, attach to the troponin, and using more ATP energy enable the cross bridges to form, resulting in contraction. And it can happen over and over again. Well, all of what I just discussed is how a muscle fiber contracts. In the next section, I'll go over how a muscle relaxes.